Hey everyone, I could really use some guidance here. My name's Jake, and my wife, Laura, and I have been hitched for close to 7 years now. We crossed paths in college, fell head over heels for each other, and before we knew it, we were saying, "I do," right after we got our diplomas. For a good while, life was pretty sweet. Sure, we had our fair share of bumps along the way like most couples, but nothing that seemed too out of the ordinary. Or at least, that's what I thought. Lately, though, things have felt off-kilter. Laura's been acting strange, snappish, distant, always glued to her phone. At first, I figured she was just stressed from work or maybe dealing with some hormonal stuff. But then there were those nights when she claimed to be working late, but I found out later she wasn't even at the office. And then there was this newfound obsession with self-care, which mostly meant hanging out with friends more than usual. To top it all off, she started turning down my attempts to get closer, brushing me off like I was a nuisance that I didn't want to jump to any hasty conclusions, but deep down, something told me something was up. I tried bringing it up with her, but every time I did, she'd get all defensive, telling me I was being overly suspicious. Yeah, we'd had our disagreements before, but this felt different, almost like something darker was lurking beneath the surface. Little did I know just how accurate my gut feeling was. Anyway, I'll dive into what went down next because honestly, I'm not even sure where to begin. This whole mess has flipped my world upside down. Any advice you all can offer would be a huge help. Alright, so this is when things started to get really strange. It was about a month back when I first picked up on something being seriously off. Laura had been distant for a while, but this time it felt different. We had plans for dinner one Friday evening. She messaged me earlier in the day saying she'd be delayed due to some urgent work matters. No big deal, right? That kind of thing happens all the time, but then, around 7 p.m., I got another text from her. "Hey, could you grab some wine on your way home? I'm still stuck at the office." "Sure, no problem." I stopped by the store and picked up a bottle of her favorite red. When I got home, though, there was no sign of her. Her car wasn't even in the driveway. I figured she was just running behind schedule, so I poured myself a glass of wine and waited. An hour passed, then 2. By 10 p.m., I was starting to worry. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I began to feel that uneasy knot in my stomach. Something didn't add up. Finally, around 11 p.m., I heard her car pull into the driveway. I went out to greet her, trying to keep my cool, but inside I was freaking out. She walked in looking like she had just come from a spa, fresh makeup, styled hair, wearing a dress I had never seen before. And she smelled different. Not her usual perfume, but something more musky, almost like cologne. "Hey," she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late, honey. Work was insane." "Laura, what's going on?" I asked, trying not to sound accusatory. "You've been gone for hours. Where were you?" She rolled her eyes, already annoyed. "I told you, Jake. Work. Why are you making such a fuss over this?" Her attitude ticked me off, but I didn't want to start an argument. I let it slide for the night, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. And worse, I couldn't stop wondering who or what she was hiding from me. The whole situation left me with this gnawing suspicion that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Alright, so the following day, I was still obsessing over Laura's bizarre behavior from the previous night. My mind kept circling back to that cologne scent and her attitude. Something was definitely off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions without concrete proof. After all, I loved this woman, right? I didn't want to accuse her of something unless I was absolutely certain. That evening, after she went to bed unusually early, I made a decision. I needed to check her phone. Yeah, I know, it's a huge invasion of privacy, but desperation had taken hold. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to get to the bottom of what was going on. I grabbed her phone from the nightstand, my heart racing like crazy. Her phone was locked with a passcode, but fortunately for me, she's always been predictable. She uses the same birthday numbers for everything. Sure enough, the phone unlocked, and I began scrolling through her messages. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just work emails, texts from her mom, and some random group chats with friends, but then I saw a message from someone named Kyle. The name didn't ring a bell, but something about it felt wrong. I opened the thread, and my blood turned ice cold. There were dozens of messages between them, all flirtatious, suggestive, and way too intimate. My hands started shaking as I read through them. They were talking about meeting up, making plans to see each other, and even exchanging pictures. One particular message stood out: "Can't wait to see you tonight. You're driving me wild." That message had been sent just hours before she came home smelling like cologne. I felt physically ill. That I scrolled further down and found an even more incriminating piece of evidence, an old message where Kyle said, "Last night was amazing. Let's do it again soon." And Laura's response? "Best sex I've had in years. Can't wait." I dropped the phone as if it had burned my hand. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My wife, the woman I loved and trusted, was having an affair. And not just a one-time fling. This had been going on for months. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the floor, trying to process what I'd uncovered. Anger, betrayal, and disbelief washed over me all at once. How could she do this to me? How could she lie to my face, sleep with another man, and act like everything was perfectly fine? I knew I had to confront her, but I needed to get my emotions under control first. I carefully put her phone back exactly where I found it and tried to sleep, though I barely managed to get any rest. All I could think about was how I was going to handle this mess. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on my chest, and I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The next morning, I was a wreck. My head throbbed, my heart raced, and every part of me wanted to scream at Laura. But I knew I had to keep it together, at least until I could get the whole story from her. I couldn't just explode without knowing exactly what she'd done. Laura woke up late, as usual, and came downstairs with that same fake smile she'd been wearing for weeks. She kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong, but I could barely look at her. Every time I glanced at her face, all I could see were those messages flashing in front of my eyes. Best sex I've had in years. Those words haunted me. I waited until we were both sitting at the kitchen table, sipping our coffee. She was scrolling through her phone again, probably texting Kyle or whoever he was, and I finally snapped. "Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, annoyed. "What now, Jake? Can't this wait?" "I'm busy." "No, it can't wait," I shot back, my voice rising. "I know about you and Kyle." Her face went pale. For a second, I thought she might faint. Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an escape route. Then, slowly, she put her phone down and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone icy. "There's no Kyle. You're imagining things." I stood up, slamming my hand on the table. "Don't lie to me, Laura. I saw the messages. I know everything. How long has this been going on? How many times have you cheated on me?" For a moment, she just stared at me, silent. Then, like a switch flipped, her expression changed from shock to anger. "You went through my phone," she spat. "How dare you invade my privacy like that?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was turning this around on me? After everything she'd done, "I don't care about your damn privacy right now," I yelled. "I care about the fact that you've been sleeping with another man behind my back. How could you do this to me?" She rolled her eyes, shaking her head. "Oh, please, Jake. It's not like you're some saint. We haven't had sex in months. What did you expect me to do? Just sit around and wait for you to get your act together?" I was floored. She was blaming me for this? "That's your excuse?" You think cheating is okay because we weren't having enough sex? That's bullshit, Laura. You could have talked to me. We could have worked on it together. Instead, you chose to betray me. She stood up, glaring at me. Work on it? With you? Please. You're so boring. Kyle actually makes me feel alive. He's fun, he's exciting, he's everything you're not. Those words cut deeper than anything else she'd said. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Here I was, trying to understand how this happened, and she was throwing it in my face like it was my fault. So, what? I asked, my voice cracking. This is over? You're leaving me for him? She hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe. I don't know yet. But I'm not staying here if you're going to act like this. Act like this? Like what? Like a husband who just found out his wife was screwing another guy. Before I could respond, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, alone in the kitchen, staring at the spot where she'd been sitting. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had just happened. The silence was deafening, and I felt completely lost, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the betrayal pressed heavily on my chest, and I realized that whatever happened from here on out would change everything forever. After Laura stormed out, I just stood there in the kitchen for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so loudly that it echoed in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. It was as if someone had torn a hole in my chest, and all these emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, confusion, were pouring out, hitting me like waves crashing against a shore. Eventually, I sat down at the table, staring blankly at the coffee mug in front of me. How did we end up here? We used to be happy. At least, I thought we were. Sure, our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is? I never imagined she'd betray me like this. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at her, but at myself too. How could I have been so blind? How did I miss all the signs? All those nights when she claimed to be working late, all those times she brushed off my attempts to be intimate, it all made sense now. She wasn't tired or stressed from work. She was with him. Kyle. Whoever he was, but beyond the anger, there was this deep, gnawing sadness. I loved her. I still do, even after everything. The idea that she could throw away 7 years of our life together for some guy she met, it crushed me. I kept replaying that moment when she told me she might leave, how casually she shrugged it off, like it didn't even matter. Like we didn't even matter. I spent the next few hours pacing around the house, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I call her? Should I give her space? I didn't know. I didn't want to seem desperate, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I let her walk away, it would be over for good. Around noon, I finally gave in and sent her a text. We need to talk. Please come home. I waited anxiously for a response, but my phone stayed silent. Hours passed, and still nothing. I started to wonder if she was already with him, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me. By evening, I was a wreck. I hadn't eaten all day, and my stomach was in knots. I poured myself a drink, something I rarely do, and sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching anything. My mind kept drifting back to those messages. The way she talked about him, the way she called their sex the best she's had in years. It was like a knife twisting in my gut every time I thought about it. Eventually, I heard the front door open. I turned around to see Laura walking in, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a mess. For a second, I thought maybe she was coming back to apologize, to tell me it was all a mistake. But then I saw the look on her face, the same cold, distant expression she'd worn earlier. Did you mean what you said? I asked quietly, my voice hoarse from hours of silence. She sighed, dropping her purse on the floor. About what? About leaving. About choosing him over me. She hesitated, then shrugged again. I don't know, Jake. I'm just confused right now. I need time to figure things out. Time? She wanted time? After everything she'd done, confused? I snapped, standing up. You're confused? You've been cheating on me for months, and you're telling me you're confused? What's there to figure out? Either you want to be with me or you don't. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. It's not that simple. Things are complicated. Complicated? That's what she was calling it. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to break down crying. But instead, I just stood there, staring at her, feeling more helpless than ever. How could she act like this was no big deal? How could she brush off the pain she had caused? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, unsure of where to go from here. Everything felt uncertain, and I knew that whatever happened next would change the course of my life forever. The days that followed were a chaotic blur. Laura remained in the house, but it felt like she wasn't really there. She was physically present, sure, but emotionally? It was like she was living on another planet. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was only to exchange terse, cold words that I tried to keep my cool at least when she was around, but inside, I was falling apart. Every night, after she went to bed, I'd sit up for hours, replaying the past few weeks over and over in my mind. How had I missed this? Why hadn't I noticed the signs sooner? And more importantly, how could she betray me like this? My emotions swung wildly from one extreme to another. One minute, I was furious, so angry I wanted to break something, anything. I couldn't believe she had the nerve to blame me for her affair, to act as if I was the problem. But just as quickly, that anger would give way to overwhelming sadness. I'd think about all the good times we'd shared, all the plans we'd made for the future, and wonder if they were all just lies, and then there was guilt. Yeah, you read that right, guilt. Even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, I still found myself questioning everything. Had I been a bad husband? Was I too boring, too predictable? Maybe if I had been more attentive, more spontaneous, none of this would have happened. It was a toxic cycle, and I couldn't escape it. One night, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at her sleeping form. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. It was surreal, knowing that this woman who I had once trusted with everything had been lying to me for months. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but then pulled my hand back. What was the point? She wasn't mine anymore. Not really. I started drinking more. Just enough to take the edge off, to numb the pain for a little while. But it never worked. No matter how many drinks I had, the reality of the situation always came crashing back down on me the next morning. And every time it did, the weight felt heavier, the betrayal sharper. Then, one evening, things took an even darker turn. I was scrolling through social media, trying to distract myself, when I saw a post from Kyle. Or rather, a photo of him and Laura together. They were standing outside some trendy bar downtown, both smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. His arm was casually draped around her shoulders, and she was leaning into him, looking happier than I'd seen her in months. I nearly threw up. My hands shook as I zoomed in on the picture, confirming what I already knew deep down. This wasn't just some fling. This was real. She was choosing him over me. Over us. I showed the picture to Laura the next day. She didn't even try to deny it. So what? She said, shrugging. It's just a picture. Just a picture? I repeated, my voice trembling with rage. You're standing there with your arms around him, looking like you're in love. How can you stand there and act like this is no big deal? She sighed, rolling her eyes again. Jake, I told you I'm confused. I don't know what I want right now. That was the moment I realized something crucial. She didn't care. Not about me, not about our marriage, not about anything. All this time, I'd been hoping she'd come to her senses, that she'd realize how much she still loved me and come back. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. She was done with me, and she didn't even have the decency to admit it outright, seeing that picture was the final straw. It shattered any lingering hope I had left. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She was moving on, and she didn't care how much pain she caused in the process. I felt utterly defeated, unsure of how to move forward or what to do next. Everything felt uncertain, and I knew that whatever happened next would change the course of my life forever. After seeing that picture, something inside me finally snapped. I couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells around Laura, constantly questioning whether every word she said was another lie. Pretending that things could somehow return to how they used to be was just a fantasy. They never would. That I needed to make a decision. After days of agonizing over it, I finally reached one. I wasn't going to beg her to stay. I wouldn't plead with her or try to convince her that we could work through this mess. Deep down, I knew she didn't want to. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. That night, I waited until Laura went to bed. I sat in the living room for what felt like hours, staring at the wall, trying to gather the courage to say what I needed to say. When I finally walked into the bedroom, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Laura was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone like always. I stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling the weight of everything we'd lost settle on my shoulders. Then, I took a deep breath and spoke. "Laura," I said quietly, "we need to talk." She glanced up from her phone, annoyed. "What now, Jake? Can't this wait until morning?" "No," I said firmly. "It can't wait. We're done." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since all this started, I saw a flicker of something other than indifference. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was guilt, I don't know. But whatever it was, it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. "What do you mean, we're done?" she asked, sitting up in bed. "You're breaking up with me?" I nodded, my voice steady. "Yeah. I am. I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this, not knowing if you're lying to me or who you're with. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine." For a moment, she just stared at me, silent. Then, predictably, the excuses began pouring out. "Jake, you're overreacting. It's not that serious. We can work through this." "Work through it?" I repeated, my voice rising. "How? How do we work through you cheating on me for months? How do we fix the fact that you've been lying to me from day one?" She shook her head, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not that simple. Relationships are complicated." "Not this complicated," I shot back. "Not when one person is screwing someone else behind their partner's back. That's not complicated, Laura. That's betrayal." She sighed, rolling her eyes again. God, how many times had I seen that expression over the past few weeks? "Fine," she said, throwing her hands up. "If you want to be dramatic about it, then fine. Go ahead. Leave. See if I care." And that was it. The final nail in the coffin. She didn't even try to fight for us. She didn't ask me to stay, didn't tell me she loved me, didn't even seem upset that our marriage was falling apart. It was like she was already halfway out the door, ready to move on with Kyle or whoever else she had waiting in the wings. I grabbed a bag from the closet and started packing some clothes. As I threw shirts and jeans into the duffel, I could feel her eyes on me, but I refused to look at her. I didn't want to see that cold, indifferent expression one more time. When I was done, I zipped up the bag and turned to face her. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "Don't call me unless you have something real to say." She didn't respond. Just lay back down and picked up her phone, scrolling through it like I wasn't even there. I walked out of the house that night, unsure where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't live in a place where every corner reminded me of what we used to have and what she had destroyed. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I realized just how much had changed. Everything felt different now, like the world had shifted beneath my feet. I got into my car and drove, not caring where I ended up. All I wanted was to escape the pain, even if only for a little while. The road stretched out before me, dark and endless, mirroring the uncertainty that now filled my life. But despite the chaos swirling inside me, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on, determined to rebuild my life without her. I left that night with nothing but my bag, my car keys, and a heart full of pain. I didn't have a plan, had no idea where I was heading. I just drove, letting the road guide me wherever it wanted. For hours, I cruised through the city, passing familiar streets and places we used to frequent together: our favorite coffee shop, the park where we had our first picnic, the movie theater where we spent countless lazy Sunday afternoons. Every place seemed to mock me now, reminding me of what I'd lost. Eventually, I found myself at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much: a single bed, a flickering TV, a bathroom that smelled like bleach, but it was better than being home. Home wasn't home anymore. It was just a house filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. I checked in, tossed my bag onto the bed, and collapsed onto the mattress. I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of traffic outside. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the confrontation with Laura. How could she be so cold? So indifferent? It felt like she had already moved on, like our marriage had been nothing more than a footnote in her life. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. Most of my time was spent lying on that uncomfortable bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. I called in sick to work, telling them I needed some personal time. I couldn't face anyone: not coworkers, not friends, not family. Not yet. I wasn't ready to talk about it, to admit that my marriage had crumbled beneath me, but eventually, reality started creeping back in. I had responsibilities: bills to pay, rent to cover, a life to live. I couldn't stay holed up in that motel forever. So, after a few days, I dragged myself out of bed, packed up my things, and checked out. I still didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back to the house. Not yet. That I ended up renting a small apartment downtown, something temporary until I could figure out my next move. It was a tiny one-bedroom place, barely furnished, but it was mine. A fresh start, or at least the closest thing to one I could get right now. The first few nights in the new place were rough. I kept expecting Laura to call, to text, to show up at my door begging for forgiveness. But she never did. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing. No calls, no texts, no attempts to reach out. It was like I had ceased to exist in her world. And then, one day, I got a message from her. It wasn't an apology or a plea for reconciliation. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was a text asking me to sign some papers, an email attachment with divorce documents. She hadn't even bothered to meet me in person or talk about it over the phone. Just a cold, impersonal message, like she was clearing out her inbox. That I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, reading the words over and over again. This was really happening. Our marriage was officially over, and she didn't even care enough to say it to my face. That I signed the papers without hesitation. What was the point in fighting it? She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I filed the paperwork and sent it back to her lawyer, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. It was done. There was no turning back now. As I sat there, staring at the confirmation email, I realized this was the end of a chapter. The weight of the past months lifted slightly, replaced by a mix of sadness and liberation. I finally accepted that our marriage was truly over, and while it hurt, I knew I had to focus on moving forward. In the quiet moments, I allowed myself to grieve, to process the loss. But I also began to see glimpses of a future beyond the pain, a future where I could rebuild and rediscover who I was without her. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. The divorce papers were signed, the process underway, but that didn't mean the pain went away. If anything, it intensified. I had thought signing those papers would bring some kind of closure, a sense of finality. But instead, it just made everything feel more real. Laura was really gone. Our marriage was truly over. For weeks after filing the divorce, I felt like I was walking through a fog. Everything seemed distant, muted, like I was watching my life happen from behind a glass wall. I'd go to work, sit at my desk, and stare blankly at my computer screen for hours, unable to focus on anything. My coworkers noticed something was off, but no one asked. Maybe they were too afraid of prying, or maybe they just figured I needed space. Either way, I appreciated their silence. At night, I'd lie in bed in my new apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship. How did we get here? How did things fall apart so quickly? I kept thinking about all the little things, the inside jokes, the lazy Sunday mornings, the way she used to smile when she saw me walk through the door. It all felt like a dream now, a memory from someone else's life, but then, just as quickly as those memories came, they'd be replaced by the harsh reality of what she'd done. The lies, the betrayal, the cold indifference she showed when I confronted her. Every time I thought about her with Kyle, about them together, laughing, touching, I felt a sharp stab of anger and hurt. How could she do this to me? How could she throw away everything we had for some guy she barely knew? I started seeing a therapist. I wasn't sure if it would help, but I figured I couldn't keep going like this. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't involved in the situation, someone who could help me sort through the mess of emotions I was feeling. In those sessions, I finally let myself break down. I cried, I raged, I questioned everything. Why had I trusted her so blindly? Why hadn't I seen the signs sooner? Was there something wrong with me that made her turn to someone else? The therapist listened patiently, offering gentle guidance, helping me untangle the knots of guilt and self-doubt that had taken hold of my mind. One day, after a particularly intense session, the therapist said something that stuck with me. "Jake," she said, "you didn't cause this. You're not responsible for her choices. She made a decision to betray you, and while it's natural to feel hurt and angry, you need to remember that this is about her actions, not yours." It was the first time I allowed myself to fully accept that truth. I wasn't the problem. I hadn't failed as a husband. Laura had made a choice, a terrible, selfish choice, but it wasn't my fault. I had loved her, supported her, tried to make our marriage work. And in the end, none of that mattered because she had already decided to leave. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it freed me from the crushing weight of guilt I'd been carrying around. On the other hand, it forced me to confront the fact that my marriage was truly over. There was no fixing it, no going back. Laura had chosen her path, and now I had to choose mine. As the weeks passed, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen much during the last few years of my marriage. They were supportive, offering a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on when I needed it. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, or at least, a version of myself that wasn't completely broken. I also threw myself into work. It was a distraction, sure, but it gave me something to focus on besides the pain. I worked late hours, took on extra projects, and before I knew it, I was getting recognized for my efforts. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of pride, not in my marriage, not in my past, but in myself. Work became a sanctuary of sorts. It was a place where I could lose myself in tasks and deadlines, where I could measure success in tangible outcomes rather than emotional turmoil. My boss noticed the change in my performance and started giving me more opportunities. I even got a promotion, a small one, but it meant a lot to me. It was a reminder that despite everything that had happened, I still had value. I still had something to offer the world. Outside of work, I started exploring hobbies I had long neglected. I picked up my guitar again, playing songs that reminded me of better times but also helped me channel my emotions into something creative. I joined a local gym, finding solace in the physical exertion and the camaraderie of fellow workout enthusiasts. These small victories began to add up, slowly rebuilding my confidence and sense of self-worth. That I also started dating casually, though I approached it cautiously. At first, it was just a way to meet new people and remind myself that I was still capable of forming connections. I didn't expect anything serious, and I was upfront about my recent divorce. To my surprise, many of the women I met were understanding and supportive. Some dates turned into friendships, others fizzled out naturally, but each encounter helped me move forward, one step at a time. Through it all, I leaned heavily on the lessons I learned from therapy. I reminded myself daily that Laura's choices were hers alone and that I couldn't control how she acted. What I could control was how I responded and how I chose to live my life moving forward. I focused on being kinder to myself, allowing myself to grieve when needed but also celebrating small wins along the way. As the months rolled on, I found myself smiling more often, laughing with friends, and even enjoying moments of solitude. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened, becoming part of the fabric of my story rather than defining it. I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about learning to live with it, embracing the good memories while letting go of the bad ones. Looking back, I can see how far I've come. The road hasn't been easy, and there are still days when the sadness hits me unexpectedly. But I'm stronger now, more resilient. I've learned to trust myself again, to believe that I deserve happiness and love without the fear of betrayal hanging over my head. If there's one thing I want to share with anyone going through something similar, it's this: healing takes time, and it's okay to take that time. Don't rush yourself, don't pressure yourself to get over it by a certain deadline. Allow yourself to feel the full range of emotions, but also give yourself permission to find joy again. Surround yourself with people who lift you up, pursue activities that bring you peace, and most importantly, remember that your worth isn't tied to anyone else's actions. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. The constant weight of sadness and betrayal that had been pressing down on me started to lift, bit by bit. It wasn't like a light switch suddenly flipped. I didn't wake up one morning feeling magically healed, but there was a gradual shift. I started waking up with more energy, my mind clearer, my focus sharper. The fog that had clouded my thoughts for so long was slowly beginning to clear. One of the biggest changes came when I finally let go of the idea that I could somehow fix things between Laura and me. For a while, even after signing the divorce papers, part of me still clung to this hope, an irrational belief that maybe she'd come back, that we could work through it. But deep down, I knew that was never going to happen. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. So, I stopped checking my phone obsessively, waiting for some sign from her. I stopped replaying our last conversation in my head, wondering if I could have said something different or done something differently. I stopped torturing myself with what and instead focused on what was the reality of my situation. My marriage was over, and it was time to move on. I started reconnecting with old friends who I hadn't seen much during the final years of my marriage. There were guys I used to hang out with before Laura and I got serious, people who had drifted away as life took us in different directions. When I reached out to them, they welcomed me back without judgment. We went out for drinks, played pickup basketball, and just hung out like old times. It felt good to laugh again, to feel like I was part of something outside of the mess my life had become. Work became another source of stability. I threw myself into projects, taking on extra responsibilities and staying late at the office. It was a distraction, sure, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was accomplishing something. My boss noticed the change in my performance and started giving me more opportunities. I even got a promotion, a small one, but it meant a lot to me. It was a reminder that despite everything that had happened, I still had value. I still had something to offer the world, but it wasn't just about work or friends. I also started focusing on myself, something I hadn't done in years. I joined a gym and started working out regularly. At first, it was just a way to burn off some of the stress and frustration I was feeling, but soon it became something more. It was a way to reclaim control over my body, to remind myself that I was still capable of growth and improvement, that I also picked up some old hobbies I had neglected during my marriage. I loved reading, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped making time for it. Now, I found myself devouring books again, losing myself in stories and worlds far removed from my own. It was an escape, but it was also a way to feed my mind, to remind myself that there was more to life than just the pain I had been carrying around. And then there was dating. I won't lie, it was terrifying at first. The idea of putting myself out there again, of trusting someone new after what Laura had done, seemed impossible. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I signed up for a few dating apps, mostly just to see what was out there. I wasn't looking for anything serious, not yet, anyway, but I figured it couldn't hurt to dip my toes back into the dating pool. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed it. Talking to new people, hearing their stories, sharing a laugh here and there, it was refreshing. I wasn't ready for anything serious, and I was upfront about that with anyone I met. But just the act of connecting with others, of realizing that there were other people out there who might be interested in me, helped rebuild my confidence. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were still moments when the pain would come rushing back. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself thinking about Laura, wondering how she was doing, if she ever thought about me. I'd scroll through social media and see pictures of her with Kyle or whoever else she was with and feel that familiar stab of anger and jealousy. But those moments became less frequent, less intense. I learned to acknowledge the feelings without letting them consume me. For instance, there was one evening when I saw a picture of Laura and Kyle celebrating some event together. They looked happy, carefree, and it stung. I felt that old anger bubble up inside me, but instead of letting it take over, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that their happiness didn't diminish mine. I closed the app and decided to go for a walk. As I walked through the quiet streets, I realized that I no longer needed her validation or her presence to feel complete. That realization was powerful. It marked a turning point for me. I started seeing my journey as a path toward self-discovery rather than a recovery from loss. I embraced the little victories, the days when I felt genuinely content, the nights when I laughed with friends, the moments when I felt proud of my accomplishments at work. These small joys began to accumulate, creating a foundation of strength and resilience. In essence, I was learning to live again, not just survive. The process was slow, sometimes painful, but ultimately rewarding. I began to appreciate the present moment more, to savor the simple pleasures that life offered. Whether it was a quiet morning with a cup of coffee, a satisfying workout session, or a spontaneous outing with friends, these experiences helped me rediscover joy. Looking back, I realized that healing is a journey, not a destination. There will always be moments of reflection, times when the past resurfaces, but now I know how to navigate those moments without getting lost in them. I've learned that it's okay to feel sad, angry, or confused, but it's equally important to allow myself to feel happy, hopeful, and fulfilled. If there's one thing I want to share with anyone going through something similar, it's this: healing takes time, and it's okay to take that time. Don't rush yourself, don't pressure yourself to get over it by a certain deadline. Allow yourself to feel the full range of emotions, but also give yourself permission to find joy again. Surround yourself with people who lift you up, pursue activities that bring you peace, and most importantly, remember that your worth isn't tied to anyone else's actions. Our stories may have painful chapters, but they don't define us. We write our own endings, one step at a time. And while the road ahead may still have its challenges, I'm confident that I'm on the right path, one that leads to a brighter, more fulfilling future. As the months went by, I began to notice something strange happening. Amidst all the pain and struggle, there were moments of unexpected joy, small, fleeting moments that slowly added up to something bigger. These weren't grand gestures or life-changing events, they were simple, everyday things that reminded me that life could still be beautiful, even after heartbreak. One of the first unexpected joys came from reconnecting with my old hobbies. I had always loved reading, but during the final years of my marriage, it became something I did in stolen moments if at all. Now, I found myself diving back into books with a passion I hadn't felt in years. I'd curl up on my couch on a Saturday afternoon, a cup of coffee in hand, and lose myself in a good story. It was a form of escape, sure, but it was also more than that. Reading allowed me to explore new worlds, to experience different perspectives, and to remind myself that there was so much more out there beyond my own pain. That I also rediscovered my love for music. Before Laura and I got serious, I used to spend hours listening to albums, discovering new artists, and attending concerts. But somewhere along the way, that part of me faded away. Now, I started building a new collection of records, filling my apartment with the sounds of bands I loved and artists I had never heard before. There was something cathartic about losing myself in the rhythm of a song, letting the melodies wash over me and drown out the noise of my thoughts. And then there was cooking. I know it sounds cliché, but learning to cook for myself again was one of the most unexpectedly joyful parts of this whole process. In the early days of our marriage, Laura and I used to cook together, experimenting with new recipes and laughing over our failed attempts. After she left, the kitchen became a place I avoided, a reminder of what we had lost. But as time went on, I started venturing back into the kitchen, trying out new dishes and finding pleasure in the simple act of creating something delicious. Cooking became a form of self-care, a way to nourish not just my body but my soul. Another unexpected joy came from the friendships I had rekindled. I mentioned earlier how I started hanging out with old friends again, but what I didn't realize at the time was how much those connections would mean to me. These weren't just people I saw occasionally for drinks or games. They were true friends who supported me through the hardest times. They listened when I needed to talk, offered advice when I asked for it, and gave me space when I needed to be alone. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I had a support system, even if it wasn't the one I had imagined. One of my closest friends, Mark, invited me on a weekend camping trip with a few other guys. At first, I was hesitant. The idea of spending a weekend in the woods, away from the comforts of home, didn't sound appealing. But Mark insisted, and eventually, I agreed. That trip turned out to be one of the best weekends I'd had in years. We hiked through the forest, built a campfire, and stayed up late talking about everything from work to relationships to life in general. There was something incredibly freeing about being out in nature, away from the distractions of phones and social media. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly present, connected to the world around me and the people I was with. It was during that trip that I realized something important. I didn't need a relationship to be happy. Sure, having someone to share your life with is wonderful, but it's not the only source of happiness. I had spent so much time focusing on what I had lost that I forgot about all the things I still had: the friends, the hobbies, the little moments of joy that made life worth living. As I continued to heal, I started noticing these small joys more and more. A walk through the park on a crisp autumn day, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of rain tapping against my window. I found beauty in the simplest things. And while I knew that healing from my divorce was going to take time, I also knew that I was capable of finding happiness again, even if it looked different from what I had imagined. For instance, one evening, I decided to try a new recipe for homemade pasta. As I kneaded the dough, feeling its texture change under my hands, I realized how therapeutic it was. The process of making something from scratch, putting effort into creating a meal, brought a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in a long time. When I finally sat down to eat the pasta, accompanied by a glass of wine and some soft jazz playing in the background, I felt a deep contentment. It was a small moment, but it was significant because it showed me that I could find joy in the mundane aspects of life. Similarly, I started taking long walks through the city, exploring neighborhoods I had never visited before. One day, I stumbled upon a small bookstore tucked away on a side street. Inside, I discovered a cozy nook filled with books from authors I had never heard of. I spent hours browsing the shelves, chatting with the owner about his favorite reads, and eventually leaving with an armful of new treasures. That afternoon reminded me that there was still so much to discover, so many experiences waiting to be had. Even the simple act of waking up early on a weekend morning, brewing a pot of coffee, and sitting outside on my balcony watching the sunrise became a cherished ritual. The quiet moments of solitude, where I could reflect and appreciate the beauty of the world around me, helped me regain a sense of peace and inner calm. Through these small but meaningful experiences, I began to rebuild my sense of identity and purpose. I realized that happiness isn't tied to any one person or relationship, it's something you cultivate within yourself. By focusing on personal growth, nurturing friendships, and embracing the little joys in life, I found a renewed sense of fulfillment. Looking back, I can see how far I've come. The road hasn't been easy, and there are still days when the sadness hits me unexpectedly. But I'm stronger now, more resilient. I've learned to trust myself again, to believe that I deserve happiness and love without the fear of betrayal hanging over my head. If there's one thing I want to share with anyone going through something similar, it's this: healing takes time, and it's okay to take that time. Don't rush yourself, don't pressure yourself to get over it by a certain deadline. Allow yourself to feel the full range of emotions, but also give yourself permission to find joy again. Surround yourself with people who lift you up, pursue activities that bring you peace, and most importantly, remember that your worth isn't tied to anyone else's actions. Looking back on everything that's happened, I can't help but reflect on the journey I've been through. It's been a roller coaster of emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, confusion, but also moments of growth, self-discovery, and even joy. And while I wouldn't wish this kind of pain on anyone, I've come to realize that there are valuable lessons hidden within the wreckage of my marriage.